And welcome back. As we go ahead and look at how to apply what we learned about while loops in order to solve some different programming scenarios. And here we have two different ones that we can approach. First one, we are looking to get user input to calculate an average. And you can see in the second one, we're looking to calculate a sum based upon a user define of how many numbers we want this to be. So there's, of course, going to be an opportunity to use a loop. Now, the first one here with calculating average, if we know how many numbers we want to average, obviously, we could, of course, just write this out as follows. We can, of course, just enter in 5 numbers. I could have 5 variables that get each of those inputs. I can then just find the total of those and then calculate the average. However, the issue with this is that this code could be simplified into a loop. And so that's what we're going to do here. I'm just going to go ahead and take this piece right on out of here. And what I want to do is remove this so that way it's going to be a loop. So instead of getting all these doubles here, so I'm just going to leave this here just for a second. I'm going to instead just use a while loop to get that input. Now we know that because we have 5 numbers to keep track of here, that means we need a total of 5 numbers that we're going to use. So let's go ahead and have a variable here. I'm just going to add here this one. So let's just go ahead and say while the total, and we're going to initialize that to 0. All right, we're going to say while total is less than 5, because we want to say we're getting 5 numbers, and since we're starting at 0, I want this to go up to 5. If I had this start at 1, we'd only get 4 inputs. The way I'd have to change it, if I started total at 1, then this would be less than or equal to 5. But this is the way it works just as well. So I'm going to start total at 0, make it less than 5. And then what I want to do is use my curly brackets to show that this is a loop, because whenever we do a loop, just like how we did if statements, we're going to use curly brackets. And then what I'm going to do is pretty much effectively the same, what I'm repeating here. So what am I repeating? Well, if you look at this, I'm getting a double, I'm getting the kb.next double. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and enter in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and use then a double num, and I'm going to set that equal to kb.next double. Now the only thing is, if you look, we are having that then also store here into a sum, right? So we need to have something that is added into here. So I'm going to add one more variable, but let's just make this a double type since this is a double. And I'm going to call this sum. I'm going to set that equal to 0. And so then what I can do is I can say that sum is equal to num plus sum. And what that's going to do, it's going to store that back into sum. So when this loop finishes, it's going to have this value. And what that should do is eliminate this entire piece right here. I'm just going to take that out. And what I want to do is also eliminate this because, again, we are now calculating that inside this loop. And you can see just how much simpler my code is now. Now, of course, I still want to find the average. So I'm going to use not total divided by 5. I'm going to make this the sum divided by 5. And we should still get the average. And if we were to run this, we should find this gets exactly the same. Now, in terms of the second one, though, we do have a slight dilemma. You notice I can't necessarily just write that out, because if I were to write that out with a bunch of code statements here, the thing that you're going to notice is that we don't have a value for us to actually use here. And because we're waiting for the user to find how many numbers we want that to be. So in this case, having a loop is almost a necessity for us to use it. So let's just go ahead and set this up with a while loop. And what we want to do is say, hey, we want count to go to some value. All right, so let's just say they put in 10. That means we want that loop to run till 10. So how can we keep track of how many iterations this loop is going through? Well, a lot of times the way we do the while loop is it will have some kind of variable that is going to keep track of how far that's going. So I'm just going to take loop count. I'm going to set it equal to 0. And what I want to do is say I want loop count, and I'm going that to be less than count. All right, because what that's going to do is going to say this is going to be my variable that I'm going to iterate, because I don't want to change count, because if I change count, that's going to affect how many numbers the person is putting in. All right, count effectively is in this case taking the place of the 5 which we had predefined before. So I had to have a separate variable that keeps track of this loop. So inside here, then all I'm going to do is, since I want to add these numbers, well, then I need a variable that's going to add up those numbers. And it's going to be very similar to kind of what we saw in the previous loop. So let's go ahead and just say, hey, you know what? Let's have one called num sum, and I'm going to set that equal to 0. And what I want to do is have num sum. I'm going to do plus equals and do kb dot next int. And what that's going to do, it's going to add whatever they get into the keyboard into the num_sum value here. And of course, I probably will want to have some kind of prompt here. So system.out.println, please enter a number to be added. And then when that loop is done, I'm probably going to want to print out that sum. So system.out.println, the sum is, and it's going to be num_sum. And one thing you'll notice is that these variables right here are all declared outside loop except for this one right here. And the reason for that is when I put a variable inside the loop, that variable is local to just that loop, which means if I made num_sum a declaration here, if I said int num_sum equals kb.xint, that would mean that when I exit this loop, I would no longer know what that value is. I would actually get an error. And I can put that in here real quickly. You can see, if I just, let's say, I'm going to call this int num_sum1 here just so you can see. And let's see if we do this, you can see it doesn't know what to do with this because it never was initialized to some value, first off. And second of all, again, it doesn't have that context beyond this loop. Whereas over here, I don't need to know what double num1 is because it's going to get reset every time this loop goes through. But sum exists up here, and because it exists outside this loop, we are able to use it here for other calculations. Another thing I want to point out is that with double num equals kb.x double, you'll notice that it never matters what that previous value was because it's always going to, pretty much every time that loop goes back through, it gets rid of the previous value of it because it's basically creating a whole new double num object. Now let's go ahead and get ready to run our code. However, before I do that, there's one thing I want to point out that we didn't do in our loops yet, which is iterate. Now, this is a common thing that students will do if they write a while loop, is they will forget to put a iteration in there. So we have to think about what is changing this loop value. So if I look here, I have total is less than 5. Okay, total is less than 5, no problem. If I run my code right now, you think that should work because, okay, I'm going 5 numbers in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh wait, it's still looking for input. Why is it looking for input? Because again, it didn't exit out this loop. Total never changed. So what I have to do is after I do the calculations that I wanted to do, I simply just have to do total plus plus. And that's simply just going to add a value to total. So as I go through that loop, it's updating that value. Same thing down here with my loop count. You'll notice we never change what the value of loop count is. So I need to just go ahead and add a plus plus operation here to go ahead and change that. So now, if I put in my 5 numbers, all right, we get the average of 3. And we say now we're in the second loop here. Please enter numbers to be added. So let's just go ahead and say we're going to enter in 4 numbers. So let's just do 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we get the sum is 10. All right, which if you think about it, 1 plus 2 is 3, 3 plus 3 is 6, plus 4 more is 10. So that works great. Again, these are just ways for us to use loops to simplify our code and to solve different problems. Again, watch out for those common mistakes like forgetting to put your iterators in. Don't use semicolons. This is something I do also see happen. People put a semicolon here, and you notice we don't get an error here. All right. However, if I try to run through that first loop, one thing that's going to happen. So I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Uh-oh. Look at my code is still going. Why is it still going? And it's because I had the semicolon here. So watch out for those common mistakes like that because they will mess with your code. They won't give you an error necessarily, but they will cause issues.